Good evening, everybody. I've opened my mouth and I'm not a Brit. So I have to confess right away. You would have ticked on that, I'm pretty sure. Why? Hopefully, you're not devastated by this. So I'll explain. I have been an Anglophile for pretty much my TV viewing life. So how this began, I'm currently right now in Peoria, Illinois. I'm from Springfield, Illinois originally. I haven't always lived in these places. I've spent about 4 years all in living in the UK, and I'll tell you how this came to happen. So the Britcom training with my mother watching PBS was great. That was an excellent beginning. My father is US East Coast with Scottish ancestry, and they drank black tea with milk and sugar. Who knew? I had no idea, in fact, this would be a pivotal sort of training ground for my later life. Well, I tell people I've had a lot of vocations and locations in my life. I started out as a journalist, and then I took 180 degrees and I went to law school. So, for the majority of my legal practice, I'm recovering. I was a criminal prosecutor. And while I was in this city in Peoria, Illinois, I happened to meet my husband, who is originally from Coventry. So he's a Brit. And that was not my plan. I had a little more pre training, though, by that time. I had done a study abroad stint in law school in London. Oh, but I didn't go figure that I'd live there one day. Well, you never know. You never know who you'll meet. So within 6 months of us getting married, his company here wanted him back to his original location in the UK. And he warned me this would happen. But I had a bit of a problem. And that was, he put it best. I hate to tell you, he said, but an American criminal lawyer in the UK is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. And I went, oh, and he was right. So I needed to find other things to do. And part of what I was doing anyway, I always loved to bake. Well, just about the time we were sitting on our sofa in the UK, our newly moved sofa from the transatlantic cargo container ship, here comes this newest show, the Great British Bake Off. And you think, Bake Off? Baking show? Is this the same show? It is. It changes name when it switches location. And when it goes transatlantic, they have to switch the name because of a potential copyright, well, it'd be trademark infringement issue with Pillsbury. So that is why there's somewhat of a difference in naming. So I got hooked on this show. It was great. But some of the translation issues in baking are not so great. So my aim for this is twofold. First off, I assume that you're into the baking if you're here tonight. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of time, not the whole time, but at least enough to get you prepared in translation. Things that I found out the hard way, how they switch from a British recipe baked to an American recipe baked, what to do with the conversion, and some of the names even are a bit lost in translation. So once we get that out of the way, then we'll tour and we'll talk about some of the different places in the UK and some of the particular baked goods that are from there, and some gold old standbys too that are considered classics no matter where you are in the UK. So with that, I hope you've had dinner. This is a tough one to see if you haven't eaten because it involves a lot of pictures like these, namely, in this one, Victoria sponge. So I'll get into more detail on exactly what this is a little bit later in the show, but for now, there you see, a very nice layer cake, very quintessentially British. So I won't get too far ahead without making sure we're all caught up on what are the differences? UK, British, English, Welsh, are these kind of muddy middle, or how do we use the terms? Sometimes Americans use them interchangeably. So here's the boiled down version. So the UK is shorthand for the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. You can kind of think of it as 4-in-1 countries. So yes, you think you speak English when you move there. And I say, haha, good for you, you naive you. Welsh is very much alive and well in Wales. They teach it in the schools. And then a very small proportion, maybe less than 7% of people in Scotland speak Scottish Gaelic too. So 63 million people-ish overall in the UK. 10 million of them alone live in the greater London area. So that's very population dense. And that's true of all the big cities. Frankly, I used to call it honey, they shrunk the island. the great big American spaces, there's London. When I lived there, I lived about 70 miles due north in a city called Peterborough. And you can see here are the different countries lit up. My husband's originally from just about here. Let's see, I look at the map. Right outside Warwick is Coventry, home of Lady Godiva. She's long since dead. And then when he was a teenager, his family moved down to the farthest southwest county that looks like a great big claw jutting out into the North Atlantic. That's Cornwall, right there. So that's usually where I hung out. The majority of the time that I spent in the UK. So here's for purposes of who's from where and what do you call them. My husband would never object to being called British. So Britain, Great Britain, comes that word Britain from Britannia. Britannia is the name that the Romans gave the big island when they invaded, 47 AD, something like that. So that's clung on. However, everybody is technically by passport British that is in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. Having said that, though, my husband is absolutely English because he's from England. And you can say the same for our old next door neighbor, used to be, well, he still is, Welsh. He's from Wales. Particularly, it's a little nicer if you know the country of origin within the UK, you can call them by that nationality. Scotland, in particular, has a very vocal, but to this point, they haven't tipped into independence, Scottish independence movement. So it's kind of important that some people in Scotland want to be called Scottish, not Scotch. That's the drink. So if you can be Irish a couple ways. You can be from Republic of Ireland down here. That is a totally separate country. In that case, you hold an EU passport. Or if you're from Northern Ireland, you might feel Irish because you're from that island, but technically you are holding nowadays a UK passport because that's part of the UK. All right, so we've got that out of the way. When I first started giving this talk, my husband, and rightly so, this is an undercurrent of our relationship, he said, "You will be discussing tea, won't you? Because you really can't discuss baked goods without tea in this context. They're like yin and yang." Okay, and I get this question a lot. What constitutes a decent cup of UK tea? Fair question. So what you see might to you look like coffee, but it's actually strong black tea, sweetener optional, with a splodge of milk, they would say, biscuit on the side, biscuit meaning cookie. And so if you would like to recreate this experience at home, I give you a few suggestions. And for that, I'll come back to you. Where I begin is that my husband, I suppose I use as the litmus test of all Brits, but he is very anti-Lipton. And that is because it's not near strong enough. That's the key. Most Brits are going to want their black tea pretty darn strong. So for that reason, we'll first turn to PG Tips, England's #1 tea. You can fairly readily find that at stores like Meijer. I can get it at my local grocery store. You could get it on Amazon. You tend to pay the most there. So if you can find it in a good grocery store international aisle, that's the best. Then TJ Maxx is a good place to look for Thai Fu. Now, this isn't really expensive. This is $4.99 for 80 bags, which isn't terribly out of the park here. And other than that, I'm looking, oh yes, here's a very fine tea that sometimes crops up at TJ Maxx, made by Taylors of Harrogate. It's just called Yorkshire tea. They have different varieties. This is just plain black tea. You can never go wrong with this one. So all of these would pass muster. What is decent tea? And my husband always says, this is his mantra to me, Claire, tea is important. This comes up a lot. So on his authority there, I give those offerings to you if you would like to recreate for yourself. So we'll talk about the show a little bit, just as a bit of fun background. And so when I started watching, there were a couple of the judges were kind of the hosts in the beginning. And so there was Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood. Now he's still around. Question for you, rhetorical. Was Mary Berry a well-known food personality in the UK before she got the show? Oh, yes, absolutely. She was very well known in food circles. She had written for women's magazines, has culinary training. She has a long-standing relationship with BBC television and on their websites, all her recipes on good food. So yes, the same could not be said for Paul Hollywood. He has very excellent food credentials, but no, he hadn't had a TV show before. So if you're after more Mary Berry, BBC is actually a very good place to look. She's reliable. Anything her name is on is likely going to be a good recipe. So over time, they kind of morphed their concept into having their hosts, then their judges, and the two women in the middle holding the cakes often are a comedy duo known as Mel and Sue. And they were doing the show for a number of years. They were very famous in the UK before they got the show. So Americans usually are surprised they're not really familiar with the personnel, but people in the UK would know who these hosts are. So their story was they met back in Cambridge as students. They were part of the Cambridge Footlights. That's the comedy troupe that gave rise to Monty Python, the holy grail, no pun intended, of British comedy. So it's quite the big deal to have been in Cambridge Footlights. And they had their own talk show. They did radio and television. So they've been around for a while. I give you a side tidbit here in the next slide. So the woman, I will back up for a moment. Sue Perkins is the woman holding the cake that says off. And if you are at all still into British food and history and comedy, dry humor, we'll put it, she was involved in, I hesitate to say a reality show because it really isn't like American at all reality shows. It was called The Supersizers Eat and Then a Period of History. And it was actually inspired by a US documentary where a man, an American, ate McDonald's for an entire month and they measured his health before and after. So that's kind of the setup. She and the ex-food critic for the Times of London, a very grumpy but funny young man named Giles Coren, were the two involved in this show. They would have all their blood work done at the beginning of a week, and then they would buy costume and food and surroundings, reenact a period of history. And they had all sorts. My favorite was the 80s. Big shoulder pads and poofs. And then halfway through the week, they took away their croissants for breakfast and they fed them Pop-Tarts because the producers told them the stock market had crashed. So it's very funny. There's a lot of banter back and forth. There were episodes on YouTube last I saw. You can also get it, I believe, on Netflix and BritBox and Acorn TV, some of the usual suspects for British television. So I put it out there. If you're into the topics, then it's a good one. So in more recent times, they have used co-hosts that are comedians and actors, but by far and away, I think the most famous they've ever had is Matt Lucas, and that is famous at least in the UK. And he has recently left. So they have announced they have a new co-host. I haven't checked her episodes out yet, but they're just recently airing in the UK. So he was in all sorts. He was on a sketch TV show called Little Britain. And that's kind of how he grew to fame. Very politically incorrect humor. I didn't necessarily follow it. I didn't watch that show, but people there knew exactly who he was. And then Noel Fielding. Now, I'd seen him pop up when I was living there. He was a host of a game show that we watched. It was very entertaining, but he does a little of everything. He is a little bit B-list. I think someone once described him, is he a random B-list guy? Well, maybe not exactly, but so people would know who he was too. In the category of judging, if you follow the show, you may have encountered Prue Leith. Leith's Cookery Bible is her claim to fame. This is how she got famous. So wonderful food credentials. She ran a cookery school with another woman. And my husband actually owned this book, and this is way before the show was a thing. One of the reasons I married him. It has about 6 variations of every British recipe that you'd ever want on onion skin paper. When they say Bible, they're not kidding. It's like King James. So they are not the only game in town. So I will tell you, there's a few more baking names if you follow British baking. If you see these, be unafraid, particularly them. You think, is this a mistake? No, the hairy bikers, they are a real thing. So the story on this was, these are 2 men that were behind the scenes workers on BBC television productions. And in that work, they happened to meet and they got on really well. They're gregarious personalities, they're bikers, and they love food. Somehow, some way, someone decided to give them a cooking show. And they've written cookbooks too in multiple series. My favorite is Mum Knows Best. They tour the country and get everyone's mother's recipe for things. So if you see their names attached to things, they're good. Also, a lot of Americans know Nigella. And in the UK, these two women kind of are like an Oprah. They can go by their first name only, they're that famous. Nigella, Delia. So, starting with Nigella, that's Nigella Lawson. She has a tremendous website if you're into British baking. And the reason I like it so well is because it converts from imperial, or no, actually, other way around, it converts from metric units that usually occur in British recipes, grams, into cups. Oh, yes. This does a lot of the work for you. So that website is just a toggle button away from not having to do a lot of math and conversions. Delia Smith has been around for forever. She's well established. She doesn't look like that anymore, quite. This is from the early 90s. But she is so famous in particular. She is part owner of the Norwich City Football Club, soccer. So if you were to go see a soccer match in Norwich and you ordered some food, you have a feeling it's going to be pretty good. So that personnel done, let's talk translation, ingredients. So this I give you is just kind of an example recipe of something you might find that's quite typical. This is coming out of a recipe for apple and blackberry crumble, I believe. I always tell people, begin with a digital food scale. Just take the aggravation right out of your life because you can work into grams right there. You don't have to sit there for hours on Google and convert things. What is a grams into cups and all that? No, no need. So some of the terms, a Bramley apple. This comes up a lot, surprisingly so. Bramley apple is really close to Granny Smith or Braeburn. And so for our purposes, you can just substitute those. Demerara sugar, a fun sounding sugar, large crystals, light brown. If you've ever had sugar in the raw in restaurants, the little brown packets, that's Demerara sugar. Castor sugar is what they refer to as our US white granulated sugar, as in it's so fine, not microfine, super fine, that's something else. But castor sugar would flow through a castor. That's where the term comes from. Another fun name, muscovado sugar. Clue, it comes in two varieties, light and dark. It's just plain brown sugar. Then there's treacle. Oops, I've skipped porridge oats. Porridge oats are just plain US rolled oats. And now we get to treacle. So treacle, dark treacle, is very, very similar to dark blackstrap molasses. It has a lighter cousin called golden syrup. More in a moment. Double cream. This is the land of creams that get poured over things or plopped, depending on their consistency. So double cream is heavy cream. Pouring cream is light cream, or half and half even. Icing sugar is powdered sugar. Sultanas are golden raisins. An essence of something is its extract. And then there's suet. Oh, controversial suet. So suet used to be traditionally the fat that surrounded beef kidneys. Well, as you may imagine, that's kind of fallen out of favor. So on store shelves in the UK, you can get vegetarian suet. It's basically Crisco. And in fact, that's a good substitute. If you buy Crisco in bars or even butter in bars, freeze it, you can grate it when it's frozen into the quantity that the recipe calls for in the suet category and pretty much get the same effect. And then corn flour is cornstarch. So I said there's two kinds of treacle. There's light treacle and dark treacle. So dark is black treacle. Light also goes by the name golden syrup. Golden syrup is its own animal. It's kind of how to describe the taste. So it's a perhaps liquefied brown sugar, but it has a really lovely buttery caramely taste. There is no easy substitute in the United States. Corn syrup won't get you the lovely buttery golden brown sugary flavor. Honey carries the flavor of honey. So if you really, really want to be authentic, opt to find it. And you can get it in the British Food Emporium websites. Various food shops on the web will carry it. You can order it on Amazon if that's your last resort. As I say, they tend to be more expensive on things. I found it at my local store. actually, in the international aisle on the shelf. So you never know. Um, but I tell you another tip, if you do get it shipped, I should come back to you and show you this because I have a real life sample here, one in the wild, actually. So here's Lyle's golden syrup. Lyle refers to Tate and Lyle. That is kind of like C&H, basically. It's a big sugar manufacturer. And these are byproducts of the sugar refining process. This occurs in this tin can and has for forever, since the 1870s, I think, and they're even using the same logo. Well, nowadays they offer this in a convenient squeezy bottle for bakers. Oftentimes, steamed puddings, cakes, take this. It retains moisture very nicely, and they'll put it in what they call tray bakes, bar cookies, translated, kind of for the same reason. It keeps things together. Well, you avoid that convenient squeezy bottle if you're going to ship because you want this in a tin. If that thing were to get punctured, oh my gosh, sticky ruin all over your bag or whatever it was they were sending it in. I couldn't imagine. So, travel tip, if you're going to transport golden syrup or dark treacle for that matter, make sure you do it in the tin. Okay, community service rendered for the evening, hopefully. All right, well, we'll go back to more ingredients for a moment. In the daunting world of flour, since it's different. Plain flour there is US all purpose flour. Self raising flour is US all purpose flour with baking soda. Sorry, powder. And I used to tell people the exact proportion so they could convert their plain flour, their US all purpose flour, into self raising flour because many British recipes call for self raising right out of the gate. But I don't have to do that anymore, really. King Arthur flour makes this. Sometimes self-raising, they might use a little different name involved, but the proportion is correct. So it's got the leavening agent already in it. Then there's strong flour. That's U.S. bread flour. And by strong, they just mean high gluten content. And then wholemeal flour is U.S. whole wheat flour. Oven settings. So when I got to the UK, we moved into my husband's old little 1911 semi-detached. So that's a duplex. And it had a tiny oven in it. And typical. Most appliances there are quite diminished from UK or US versions. And they told me it worked on gas marks. And I just stopped in my tracks. And I thought, I really don't want to inquire further about what is a gas mark. I didn't want to say those words, but then it dawned on me, Claire, we're going to need to eat. You're going to need to learn the oven. So I asked the dreaded question. And so it turns out all it is a UK system that it's a gas oven and the strength of the flame is marked from 1 to 9 on the knob. And that's it. End of story. Okay, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought. So most British recipes are going to give you temperatures in Celsius. A few of the older ones might do you a favor and give them in Fahrenheit. This is easily found on the internet. So there's a recipe packet that's included with this talk. I understand it'll be beamed to you in with the recording of this afterward if you were registered, and it's available online. More on that in a bit. But this, though, is pretty easily gotten. And even older recipes, really old ones, have these really nebulous terms, like put it in a cool oven, a moderate oven, a very hot oven. So you kind of have to know what are they talking about. Sometimes the baking show comes out with the term, it's a fan oven, or I've seen it for sure in recipes. Fan just means convection. That's their shorthand. Last one, liquid measurements. So if you're asked for a dessert spoonful of something, it's about a teaspoon. Some recipes, older ones usually, call for cups. Most are going to be, though, in milliliters or liquid ounces. Most Americans are okay with this because right on the back of our Pyrex, ounces, is the milliliters. So that doesn't bother us too much. A lot of UK puddings, desserts, are steamed in a steaming basin. I have one with me here, and at the end, I'll hold it up and show you. It's best in a bigger picture. So on liquid pints, a US pint, you may know, is 16 ounces. That is not true in a British situation. They're going to be referring to an imperial pint. And for that, we'll go to the live example. You see it in the picture, but here's one. Right there are the markings. So it says on the glass right there, it says pint to line. The PT is a little bit worn off. Pint to line. This is 19.2 liquid ounces up here. So just note to self, if you're asked for a pint, put in 19.2 if it's a British recipe. Don't short it and use the US 16. Then you see this is an imperial pint. There's the crown. This is the real thing. And then they even on these glasses mark half pint. And so good to know for the pub. That's what they look like. They're a bit more generous in their pints, perhaps, at the pubs there than we are here, just because the imperial pints, that's much different. All right, so we've got all that out of the way. Let's tour. So first destination is the home of, ashamed to say, but it's true. I just confess, I'm honest. This is my all-time favorite British baking recipe, sticky toffee pudding. Oh, so it's coming from the Lake District, very lovely part of the world. This is in the upper northwest corner of England, a series of lakes, not just one. The one that you see in the picture is Lake Windermere. So it's green on the map. That means it's a national park. It's very adjacent to the Yorkshire Dales National Park. All of this is God's country for sure. Sticky? Oh, yes, quite sticky. Why? Because of the toffee. So toffee isn't the hard candies we're thinking of. They're meaning caramel in this context. And pudding here is going to mean a cake. So very sticky caramel cake, if you want to translate it. So cultural side note, a bit of cultural reference. The Lake District is perhaps best known also by residency for a particularly famous person who moved there from London, but became kind of a home county, or not home county, the person that they'd like to claim, Beatrix Potter. So she was a rare person in her time. She was financially independent as a single woman. She was an author and illustrator who got famous in her lifetime and rich. She got money off the sales of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and with that, she acquired Hilltop Cottage in 1905. It's in a little village near Sawrey, Sawrey, and the National Trust owns it. This is a group, it's a land trust that they manage hundreds of properties all over the UK. So you can go see this cottage. It's more than a cottage. It's pretty big, actually. So a lot of her books, once she got situated there, feature her home and drew inspiration from the surrounding area. Case in point was the sequel to Tom Kitten, The Tale of the Jam Roly-Poly. And not to give you too many spoilers, but Tom Kitten is kidnapped by two rats who attempt to roll him up in pastry and butter and bake him. And that would replicate a very quintessentially British dessert called a jam roly-poly. They tried to make a kitten roly-poly out of him. So the spoiler, he is rescued. This is good. But Beatrix Potter said she was inspired to draw those characters because she had never seen bigger rats than the ones she had at Hilltop Cottage. Oh, so on her death, she gifted all sorts of land in this part of the world to the National Trust as part of inheritance. So today you can visit much of what she formerly owned in the Lake District National Park. So back on the pudding. What is it? So New Zealand and Australia, they're kind of up for debate. Airmen get the origin story of bringing this recipe to the Lake District. So it's this very, very moist cake. It's usually made dark by dark treacle, sometimes dates, sometimes tea. I have seen all three. And dark treacle is a non-negotiable. That's usually always in these recipes to give it the color. And modern classic. It's everywhere. It's unusually sweet. Most British have a less of a sweet tooth than Americans, but this is an exception. So it's usually best served warm, and they're covering it with when it's homemade. I like the homemade, but it's this really lovely thick caramel sauce that I like to use like a stripe it rich cake. If you remember those from Jell-O, you put holes in the cake and pour the sauce on top, and it permeates the cake. And then they might go a step further and actually put something on top, like you see in the picture. That's whipped cream or ice cream or clotted cream. Oh my gosh. So, but the other classics that you see on British menus frequently, Bread and butter pudding, that is a favorite. I don't talk about it much just because it's never been one of my favorites. Oh, travesty, sorry if you love it. But as I told you about jam roly-poly, so in life, that is a sponge cake, small, thin layer that's been rolled up into a pinwheel with jam in the center. Lots of school kids got served that. And then something fun, spotted dick. Is it obscene? Oh, no, no, no. So it is a little sponge cake, and the spots are merely dried currants that have been incorporated into the cake. Usually they steam that. A little girl, I heard a story that had it served at her boarding school repeatedly, got to call that spotted dick fly cemetery because of the little currants inside. There is a wonderfully commercially available brand of this, and it actually came from a place, Cartmel. Cartmel is a village in the Lake District, and it began with their village shop, and that was their post office. So post offices in the UK are terrific. They sell way more. They're like little convenience stores. And this one in particular, Cartmel's, sold picnic items because a lot of people would come through looking to picnic in the Lake District, and their sticky toffee pudding was supreme. And they got so well known that they morphed into a factory, and now there's a brand. There is a UK chain of grocery stores called Waitrose, and you can buy this brand there, and it's served in a little aluminum pan, like a loaf pan, and you bake it at home. Oh, yes, very good. So, bad news. Yeah, here's some bad news. Sorry. It's rocket fuel. Really, how do I cut around that? I don't. The recipe that Mary Berry purports to use, if you cut it into 6 pieces, each contains 927 calories, 88 grams of carbs, and 59 grams of fat. So this is not one to have the evening before your fasting lipid profile or glucose test. Absolutely not. It is atypically sweet. So for that, some people are off it, but in small quantities, it's powerful. It's like a drug. So, well, hey, let's leave behind the whole health thing and get into some fruit portions. So we'll do that. This is ubiquitous. Everywhere in the UK will offer you blackberry and apple crumble, particularly in the fall, because that's when the fruits are in season. So here's more on that Bramley apple. This is this apple brand, this variety that comes up all the time. I see it in recipes continually, and it took me a while to figure out what exactly is it. A very popular British cooking apple. They're huge things. They can get way bigger than American softballs. They're green apples. They're tart, so they're definitely a cooking apple, but they don't disintegrate when they bake. They keep their golden fluffy consistency. And even that they occur in sausages. I used to go to Tesco grocery store and get apple and Bramley apple sausage. Oh my, those are very, very good. If you were a purist, you could try finding this in the US. And where to look? This is called Bramley seedling here, an heirloom species of apple. Do you have to try that hard? I have not. As I said before, you can substitute Granny Smith and Braeburn and just be fine. So, as a side anecdote, a lot of the fruit in the UK is grown in Kent. This is a county to the southeast. It's down by London on the shore. And many places in the UK have a microclimate, and sometimes microclimates within microclimates. So as far on the earth north as they are abnormally warm, not in a really hot way, but just knowing that London is on the same latitude as Saskatchewan, Canada. And they have nothing in common, really, where climate is concerned. It's that Gulf Stream, this warm air current that splits when it hits the island. Part goes to the English Channel, the other part to the Irish Sea, and it keeps them warmer than they ought to be. Now, it keeps them in clouds and rain, too, but they can grow all sorts. Kent grows the strawberries for Wimbledon. When the dessert of choice at Wimbledon is always strawberries and cream, fresh ones, and they're taking the train from Kent into the stadium every day. So speaking of berries, let's talk blackberries. One of my favorites. So the season is on now. Yes. Season runs from August to October in the UK. And there's a little tradition in the Church of England. There's a holiday called Michaelmas. It's on the 29th of September. And the legend goes that you're not to have consumed berries after this date because the devil will have spit or stamped or done worse to them. Well, I'm a total fruit addict, and I have just decided to take that with a grain of salt, and here I am. So I don't know if I'm going to a hot place after death, but I am here now. Well, they're everywhere. They're on public footpaths and they are completely naturalized. They've been growing in the UK for 8,000 years. And one of my favorite things to do was with my husband, we would go to these public hedgerows and we'd pick and we'd bring Gladware and Ziploc bags and pick and pick and pick. And we would be there with people doing the same thing. They'd never run out. The berries are huge and lovely. If they've had a good rain season, they're as big as your thumb joint. And then you put them in the freezer and you can have apple and blackberry crumble all year long. And since they're in season with apples together, that's nice. Their seasons overlap. So the crumbles are very good this time of year. Custard. Ooh, this is in the category of caloric things Brits put over their puddings. And they're not talking cold custard, not ice cream sort of custard. This is hot egg custard. So you can make it pretty easily just using cream or milk and eggs and as much sugar as you like. But I would say the majority of people making custard in the UK use the powdered variety. So this is usually Bird's custard. You can readily find that in import food aisles too. So the story about this, oh, you can buy it on Amazon for a little more money. That's what it's supposed to look like. So hold that picture in your mind, and I will share my tale of kitchen woe so that you don't replicate my mistake. So here is my exhibit A, Bird's original custard powder. Way back before my husband and I were married, we were still living in the US. We hadn't moved over to the UK back yet. We were hosting a dinner party for a bunch of expat Brits here in Peoria. And the kind of consensus was nobody had had custard in a long time, food of their youth. Let's have that. I heard somebody mutter, in my family, men made the custard. Well then, tell us what you really think, Ben would say. It wasn't Ben. I thought, well, we'll just snip that in the bud. I can read. I'm going to use literacy and measuring and the directions, and I'm going to prove him wrong. I will make it. I can read. So it had a couple sets of directions on the back, and I was particularly happy to spy because I had a lot going on in the kitchen that day. Let's see if it'll let you see it. There it is. Microwave. Ooh, microwave. It saved my time. So I followed it to the letter. It won't set up. I add more powder. I add more time. Rinse and repeat the cycle. It's just not doing what it's supposed to. So finally, I do get it to set up. It is no longer this light yellow, lemony color. It is self-tanner orange. And I could barely stir it. I got my spoon through it. I turn around and come back. And now the spoon is stuck like a popsicle stick in the middle. And I could pretty much extract the entire thing out of the Pyrex. Oh, well, we're pretty much out of powder too. So I had to confess to the diners, and they were pretty gracious. There was a lot of this, and someone muttered, "Oh, my precious custard powder," unquote. However, what I should have done is followed this column instead. It says, on the hob, on the hob. That is the way. So the hob is Brit speak for the stovetop. What you need is a way to make this in a really thick bottom pan because it's going to be milk brought up to heat so it doesn't scorch, and you stir it a lot and you can control the heat. Those are the things you need to do good Bird's custard. So I've kind of resigned, frankly. I mean, if I had to, I could do it, but I was defeated. But I tell you that, just because I wasn't able to rise to the top of the custard heap doesn't mean that you can't try. So let's return and we'll talk more. We'll go to a different place, in particular, a lovely city well worth visiting called York. So if you go on a very direct train out of London in the southeast, you can get to York pretty much 2 hours due north. What it's most famous for, at least architecturally, is York Minster. That's the cathedral that you see. Right under the cathedral are Roman ruins. And so the cathedral was built on the basis of the Roman settlement. In fact, the fortress is right in their undercroft. It's great to tour. And then once the Romans left, eventually the Vikings came about 800. And they have quite the Viking going on there. York is on the East Coast, so it's close to Scandinavia for Viking access, smash and grab raids, all that good stuff. It was called Jorvik in Viking times. So that's where the term, the name York comes from. It's derivative from Jorvik. They have a terrific Viking center, a museum, Jorvik Viking Center. So they've got a castle museum. That's where you see Roman sarcophagi turned into delightful planters, if that's your thing. The York Museum and Gardens, and the best preserved medieval walls in the UK. And that's saying something because there's quite a few. Great ghost walks. It's spooky there. I even took it, and I'm kind of faint of heart. And then a street called the Shambles. Shambles is a medieval term for a meat market, actually. And now that you understand that, in the land of no refrigeration in the time, about midday, a meat market in medieval times would turn into a real shambles. So that's kind of where that term comes into modern language. They have a rule breaker there called the Yorkshire pudding. It is not a dessert, it's a bread item. More in a moment. And then that used to be, they still sell these Yorkie bars, these chocolate bars. Oh my, they're good. Their slogan for a period of time was, "It's not for girls." Oh, wow. The same guy who said his family had only the men made custard must have thought that one up. Well, food item wise, what's from York, particularly rhubarb. And they are, in fact, known this area of the world as the Tusky Triangle. Tusky is kind of a slangy term for rhubarb there. So there's about 9 square miles of this Tusky Triangle in West Yorkshire, and they force it. So what they're trying to do is get the leaves are not developing. They just want the stalks because they want to keep the plant's energy there. It's from Siberia originally, this plant, but not that Yorkshire's like Siberia in climate too much, but at least the dark and the rain, that part, and the somewhat colder weather compared to the rest of the UK. Well, it grows so fast, they claim, in the sheds that they use for forcing, that if you go on Wikipedia and I believe it's under Tusky Triangle, you can listen to a sound file they allege is the sound of rhubarb growing. Now, talk about if you're desperate and you've already watched the paint dry. Well, I put it out there. So just as a little sideline too, for our gardeners in the audience, now, bear in mind, what were we just talking about? Look at this picture. This is from the extreme southwest. This is the county Cornwall, where my husband moved in when he was an older child, a teenager. And particularly, I'll give you a bit of a zoom in. So in the foreground is a labyrinth. That's made out of camellia, actually. But in the background is where I want to point your attention to. If you want to put your fingers on the chat and weigh in on what is this, just look at it. So the shape of the leaves should give you a bit of a hint, but look at the size of the thing. So right below is a woman in blue. She could very easily fit underneath this canopy, basically, this forest. So in chat, would anybody like to weigh in at all about what they think this plant might be? It grows in a like subtropical garden. Thoughts? Or librarians? I think you're allowed to if you would like. I see we have rhubarb and kale, I see as answers. Well, the first one, rhubarb, is correct. This is giant rhubarb. Oh yes, giant rhubarb. So in life, the wingspan of these leaves can get between 4 and 5 feet across, and it can get as high as 10 feet in the air. However, 2 things to know. You don't want to really get lost in the rhubarb forest. It's incredibly spiky in there. All the stems are very sharp. They can impale you. Secondly, completely inedible. This is grown as like a trophy plant. So it's a decorative, but they do call it giant rhubarb. Go figure. It's very Alice in Wonderland, I think. Well, rhubarb that's edible occurs in all sorts of food items and drinks. Gin, boiled sweets, that'd be hard candy, yogurts, tea. Taylor's of Harrogate, that makes Yorkshire tea, also makes a really good rhubarb tea. And those 2 kind of bell jars, basically made out of clay. Those are used for forcing rhubarb. But here in Illinois, too warm. We tried it, we fried it. Absolutely won't work. So more on what is a Yorkshire pudding. As I alluded to that, here's a picture. So if you go to York and you're in a pub and you order a roast dinner, if you're like us, it might arrive in a plate-sized Yorkshire pudding. It is an unsweetened, puffed up pancake. But most people are not eating them plate-sized. Most are eating what they call mini Yorkshires. They can hold things or they can be like a bread roll served on the side. Mostly in roast dinners tend to gravitate to these. And they keep them in the freezer aisle. You can get them in a bag and put them in the oven. Like this, a muffin tin would do little ones. So how do they get the puff? They chill batter first in the fridge, and then they superheat oil in these pans, and they pour cold batter into hot oil, and it gets thermal shock and it puffs up. And they slam it into a hot oven, and they leave it for a little bit and then crank the oven back down. And that's what causes the good rise. So a riff on this is toad in the hole. Oh, another fun food name. So toad in the hole is merely a huge Yorkshire pudding that before it was baked had tucked sausages into it. Now this one is rather deflated. It's lost a bit of altitude. So the toads are supposed to be the sausages peeking out. Onion gravy optional. So on the topic of more touring, most Americans, when they start out in the UK, they tend to gravitate to London. And is it a shame? Well, not really. There's some beautiful, interesting places to see there, but there's also the same in other parts of England or the UK. This is kind of my highlight reel of castles in or near London, one of which is associated with a food item. So more in a moment. So the picture you see is Hampton Court Palace. So that's most famous for being the home of King Henry VIII, one of his homes. You can either go there by car conventionally, or in good weather, you can take a boat. You can take a ferry from the middle of London on the Thames River all the way past Kew out to Hampton Court. So that's a very nice way to travel, way less traffic and scenic. Windsor Castle is just west of London, and by west, it's a good stretch by 30 miles or so. It's directly across from Heathrow Airport. Windsor is right there next to Heathrow. If you have a really bad layover, I always stay in Windsor because it's a lot more scenic and less flights going on overhead, a few still. Or the Tower of London. That is the fortress that came out of the Norman conquest of 1066 when William the Conqueror came over from Normandy in modern France. And he was the last successful invader of England. And so the tower is the center. The whole complex is really referred to as the tower, but the first building was indeed the tower, and now it's grown into this fortress. That's where the crown jewels are and the beef eaters. So those are touristy things to want to see too. And then there's Kensington Palace. That's in modern central London. That's where Diana, Princess of Wales, lived, and so do William and Catherine sometimes too. So where are these places? Laser pointer. Tower of London, we're just going to follow the Thames River. That's easy. So the Tower of London is in the oldest part of London. London's former name was given to it by the Romans, Londinium. And the city of London is the old Londinium. In fact, they still have parts of the Roman wall that existed. So there's that, and we just snake through. We get a little farther away from the river, though, to go up to Kensington. That's in the northwest corner of a big central London park, Hyde Park, and more snaking around. About here, we deviate. You can't get there by river to go out to Windsor and Heathrow. You either have to take the tube or take a cab, something like that. But it's, to get to the airport, basically, it's off this map. But follow it around. Ooh, here's a little town, Richmond. If any of you have watched Ted Lasso on Apple TV, you know that the football team involved is AFC Richmond. There's Richmond. That's what they're referring to. And then very, very close by is Hampton Court. There's the palace. Still not very far from the river. There's the river, and there's the complex. So which of those refer to a food item or have one that's kind of famous in tandem? It's Hampton Court. Richmond Maids of Honor. These are little cheese tarts. So the legend goes that King Henry VIII came, well, if you've seen his pictures, You can tell he never really turned down a snack. He questioned a group of ladies in waiting to his queen, Catherine of Aragon, first wife. She kept her head. And they're eating these little cheese tarts. So he's offered one, he tries it, he deems it delicious, and he orders the recipe in a locked box where it remains for 200 years until a pastry shop in Richmond gets access. So whether you believe that story or not, it's a good story. And they're cute little tarts too. So let's go down to Cornwall. That's that farthest southwest county, home of giant rhubarb. What they're most known for is mining. For thousands of years, they have mined in this part of the world, not so much anymore because it's mined out. But the structure that you see in the picture is a Cornish mine house. That's made of granite. And that originally would have held a steam engine that pumped water from flooding the underground mines. And in that case, these are right on the ocean. These mines and that one go underneath the seafloor. So a Cornish pasty, note the pronunciation, short A, pasty, it's basically a meat turnover. So the very traditional ones, they have a short crust pastry that surrounds it with a really thick crimp on the outside edge. And then there's skirt steak inside, it's diced steak, potatoes, onions, no carrots. That's controversial. Rutabaga, but they would call it by another name. The Brits call rutabaga swede. So it's all that with salt and pepper baked into this turnover shape. And the miners would take these on their lunch breaks and dinner breaks into the mines. And they would hold it by the crimp and eat the interior, but they would never touch something they planned to put in their mouth. So they would throw away the part they were holding. And that's because part of the ground, what's in Cornish landscape, is arsenic. Ugh. Well, when we lived in the UK, how could we not visit a village called Bakewell? I mean, they say the proof is in the pudding. There it is. And it's in a very lovely neck of the woods, too. It's quite adjacent to the Peak District National Park. That's good hiking, lots of filming, kind of barren, but beautiful. They filmed modern Wuthering Heights there. Well, what we were after was pastry. Particularly me, I opted to go to the original Bakewell pudding shop. And upper left-hand corner is a Bakewell pudding. So that's got a baked egg custard, basically, in the middle of a short crust pastry. It isn't terribly sweet. My husband, though, he could not resist the Bakewell tart. This is his all-time favorite UK dessert, lower left-hand corner. That's a homemade one. That sweet crust pastry, so sugar in it, with a layer of usually raspberry jam in the bottom, and then a almond cake layer called frangipan. And if it's done well, it's like a good brownie. It develops a little crunchy crust on the top, and then they coat it in icing sugar. So the one on the right, though, is the type of Bakewell pudding, or sorry, Bakewell tart that you can find in UK grocery stores. And it's made by a brand that cracks me up. So if you've heard of Little Debbie, this is Mr. Kipling. It is. It's a brand of UK pastry. Mr. Kipling makes all sorts of little handheld cakes and pies and tarts. I say it's Little Debbie's British uncle. But that case, it has the icing sugar on top and the little cherry they usually stick in the middle. So Victoria Sponge, we saw this in the beginning. Was it a fan of Queen Victoria, or was Queen Victoria a fan of this? Oh, yes, yes. What is it? So 2 layers of sponge cake, not like memory foam that we get. No, just really nice yellow cake. And they sandwich it together with a layer of buttercream. Traditionally, it's strawberry jam. Now you can riff on this in any number of ways. And then they merely dust the top with icing sugar and they call it a day. They don't coat it like our cakes are. So one of my favorite quotes was from this little snippet. It says, "You will encounter a Victoria sponge in most tea rooms in England. It will be a friendly encounter." Oh, yes. In fact, if most tea rooms in England, if they didn't sell this, they'd be quick out of business. This is a riff. We have to bake gluten-free at my house, and King Arthur flour is my go-to on all things gluten-free baking. And this is from Nigella, a birthday custard sponge using my arch nemesis, bird's custard powder, in the buttercream. It's really good. I can't mess it up there. And then a milk chocolate ganache, and the little bits on top we'd call nonpareils. They call them hundreds and thousands. And now I think that's a better name because that's exactly how many landed on my floor when I was done. But that's a great recipe too. Christmas pudding. What is it? It's everywhere. So it's not due to a region, but is it a fruitcake? No, not really. Fruitcake is fruitcake. So this is super rehumidified dried fruit. And it's soaked overnight in any number of mediums. You can choose what you like. And there's kind of a limited amount of cake batter added in, and it's steamed. It's steamed for ages. In fact, my husband is in charge of steaming ours, which is great because he chooses to do his overnight. So he does like a 8 hour steam, and it's a big stock pot with a bit of water, maybe not even halfway up to where the container that the cake is going to sit. And then the steam just permeates. And I'll show you how you would steam something. But he checks it. He makes sure that it won't boil dry. It just needs to steam for a long time. They start these back in October. Now we make ours in early December, and even they have a day mixing up Sunday, I think, that's in late November. All of these are fine as long as you don't crack into it, because it's been steamed for so long, it's basically hermetically sealed. You keep it in a cool, dark place, it'll be okay. They flame it. Woohoo! Brandy, can do, or rum, or put brandy butter on it, or any of the creams I mentioned, or custard, or ice cream, you name it. So it is its own animal. It turns really dark, and that's because the sugars in it caramelize, the fruit sugar, and there's tons of fruit. Speaking of fruit, sometimes they get baked into scones or scones, depending on where you're from. Plain, fruited, savory. There's all sorts. So the recipe packet that this talk uses has incorporated the National Trust's version of scones, which are terrific. They run a lot of tea shops with their properties, so they're kind of well known. They never served a bad scone, particularly in the Southwest. Clotted cream is the go-to. So if you're having a cream tea, what does this mean? It's a cup of tea plus a scone, clotted cream, and strawberry jam. That's kind of it. Uh, Cornwall and Devon are the two Southwest counties that gravitate particularly. What is clotted cream? It sounds bad. Why are they putting clots in the title? Valid question. You have to suspend your disbelief. It's coddled sweet cream. It's been heated with a low heat over time, and it reduces. It has whey separating out in one layer, and then in the top, it's this really silky texture. It's almost like a soft cream cheese in texture, but not in flavor at all. It has no tang to it. It's incredibly sweet. It even gets a little lactose sugar crust on top. So again, not one for the fasting lipid profile night before. You can make it at home, believe it or not, if you use non-ultra pasteurized heavy cream. Organic Valley usually is the brand nationally available for this. It hasn't been super high heat treated, so it hasn't lost some of the reaction you need to provoke the clotted cream. You can make it in the Instant Pot on the yogurt setting, and I have done it. And my stiff upper lip spouse gives it a reaction like this. And that is high, high praise. So it works. And you can find that recipe in the packet too. Well, I have to end it somewhere. So let me recap. If you are pining for the recipes, go to my website. That's teawithclaire, CLAIRE.com. That's a hub of all things that I find interesting about the talks I do. And my Facebook page, particularly, I see a lot of gardens and tea and food. And I've read an article lately in the New York Times, is coffee edging out tea? Controversial. And so I tend to post things like that. And I have a book out. I wrote a memoir of my funny, good life when we were living in the UK. It's an upper, it's not a downer of a memoir. It at one point had hit #1 in England travel on Amazon. So it's just come out the last day of August, so it's fairly newish. It's called High Tea and the Lowdown, An American's Unfiltered Life in the UK. You can get it pretty much anywhere online, and I'm working on the audiobook as we speak, not literally, but this morning and days before. So that should be out within the next month. So I will come back to you, and I'll see if anybody might have had any questions as we've been going along here.
Claire, Gigi wants to know, have you been able to make gluten-free versions for all the British recipes? And
Not
do
always.
American gluten-free all-purpose flours work? I'm interested in any tips you have specific to gluten-free.
Okay. Uh, yes and no. I have not, I have attempted a Yorkshire pudding with gluten-free flour. It wasn't so good. So the trick on gluten-free is the raise because you don't have gluten. And is the texture the same too? So that was a bit off. I usually, I said before, my default in baking gluten-free is King Arthur flour, simply because I think that's the best reliable one, especially the mixes. The mixes are very good. Let me think. Yes, we have traveled and found very good gluten-free versions. In particular, my husband was overcome with joy to find in Cornwall a gluten-free Cornish pasty. And that was just jubilation because he doesn't ever get them anymore. I used to import them from Michigan, actually. I think, was it Michigan or Minnesota? Because of Cornish populations there having to do with the mines, there's some decent Cornish pasties to be had. So if you find a good pastry crust, you're in. Let me think. Was there another part of the question I didn't address since I didn't read it? I'm not 100% recall there.
Uh, no, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Had you been able to make gluten-free versions and do American gluten-free all-purpose flours work?
And yes, when you rely on them in a cake, yes, they're good. For things like a sticky toffee pudding, fine. Not so much where I really have struck out on Yorkshire pudding, though, which reminds me of things steamed. I kind of promised I would show this. I don't want to forget. So I have a very particular steaming basin that's purpose made. You don't need this. This is the fancy part. I like it because it's dummy proof. It gives me directions. When steaming, water bath to this line. Wahoo. So I don't overdo it. And then even on the inside, it says put your cake batter basically only up to that line. So without this, you just need a Pyrex glass bowl and you grease it like you would. You're greasing a cake pan and you grease, instead of a lid, a piece of wax paper and you put it on the top, way over the top, not on the top of the batter. And there's a layer of tin foil that goes over that. And then you tie it up with twine and you make a little bow underneath too. And the bow is going to be so you can pull it out of the water bath. And see, mine even has all these, here's where you put your string. I like to use my bow in the center because it's less likely I'll wind up in the burn unit if I have kind of a level string to pull it up with. So that's how you'd go about steaming something. Steamed cakes, steamed puddings are really moist. And it's a nice way to reheat stuff too. Let us see. Anything else I see come through? I saw something go by about gelatin, but
Yeah.
I want to not get ahead of my moderator. So you can give me what the questions are in order. How's that?
Okay. Kathy says on Great British Bake Off, they use sheet gelatin often. I've never seen that in the US. Can you use regular gelatin like Knox?
Yes. Yes, that's a quirky British thing. I haven't seen it here either. And I've had a British woman that commented too, just that's a quirk of them, that's the form it tends to be in. And just like they roll their stuffing into little balls, and I tend to bake mine in a pan, like for Thanksgiving, or stuff a turkey with it, and they'll do that too. But little balls, it's just a different form of the same thing. So that's just them. But no, I have not seen that here. And yes, you can use plain gelatin in the granular form like we have.
I did see a question earlier. Janie wanted to know, is a Yorkshire pudding like a popover?
Similar in texture, yes, I would agree with that. Um, but popovers, though, I think start with chew. Isn't that right? That is the pastry that I'm trying to think. See, popover. So let's back up. Yorkshire pudding batter is pancake batter. It's very thin. It's not super thin. It's like the consistency of heavy cream. So it's not a batter per se. So, and when I'm thinking, my mom made popovers, I think years ago, but she made chew-based pastry that was quite thick, and you had to stir it in a pan, cook it in the saucepan first. So I think The doing of it might be a bit different, but the end result might be similar texture. But yeah, it's basically, if you think about it as a Dutch baby pancake, I've heard of that before. Pancakes, non-sweetened pancakes, but bread sort of bread-like and very airy. They shouldn't be flat like doorstops. That would be a bad Yorkshire. That's happened to me too. So.
All right. I see another question. I see some comments, but I did see a question from Susan. Do you have a good eaten mess recipe?
Eaten mess. Okay, so I got to tell people, what is this? So eaten mess is a dessert that's been, it's using meringue and cream and fruit, usually strawberries in season. I've seen, and they just jumble it together, basically. Eton is a boys' school and a place not far from Windsor, actually. So I think the name comes from that neck of the woods. It is not my favorite, I confess. So, do I have a good recipe? No, I'm afraid I don't, but I can point you to one. I have seen, and I'm sure it's probably pretty good. And there's a Harry Potter cookbook. I have looked at that for professional reasons. I do a Harry Potter talk too, and I believe I saw Eton Mess in there. And I looked through it and thought, yeah, that's pretty realistic from based on, I think I've had it the once. So I'm not an expert, but if you're looking for a particular source of a decent recipe, I think that might be one.
And there are a few
We also had a
comments.
question.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Dee, go
That's
ahead.
okay.
I was going to say, have you ever been in Canada and visited one of the British importer shops called British Pride? I will look next time for the golden syrup.
I have been in Canada and I did not know about these shops. So thank you for that. I will mark that down in the notes. So if next time I'm there, have a look. We tend to stock up on maple syrup or ice wine, but it's golden syrup too. See, that's a category of, do you really want to stock up too much on golden syrup? Expanding waistlines may not thank you for that, but you're right. That would be a great place to look. It's hard. It can be a little hard to find.
And then Catherine said, really enjoyed the talk. I've just discovered the Monty Don gardening shows from England. Love them. This talk was a good compliment to Monty's shows.
I love Monty Don. I have definitely seen those shows, and he's great. He'll talk about all sorts of quirky British topics too. So you'll learn a lot if you stay tuned into him. So he's been on for quite a while, because I remember watching his shows when we lived there, and that was in the latest stint, 2009 to 12, and there he was. So.
And then Anne says, the pasty you mentioned is probably from Michigan, where the Finns adopted it for the copper mines, where the Cornish miners probably introduced it. Now a big part of Finnish American traditions.
Oh, I did not know. I only know it in the context of the Cornish, because that's usually what's pointed out to me with somebody who's lived in Cornwall. But we used to, and we still do, enjoy going to a little town in South Wisconsin called Mineral Point. And that was another Cornish mining colony. And they'll do decent pasties too. And they have a Pendarvis. Pen is a very Cornish name, lots of Cornish names there too. So yeah, just look for the mines, basically. Even Arizona, I've been told, has some decent pasties because of the mining out there too.
Okay, next we have Danielle wanted to know, are there any favorites of your British cookbooks that you find yourself going back to time and again?
Yes, let me distill them. Well, Leith's Cookery Bible, if you're a purist, if you want to know how to make anything. What I tend to do anymore, I own a lot of Nigella, and I will, though, go to her website and replicate it. And that's because the Nigella that I own was all bought in the UK, and it's got metric measurements, and I can do them. I just prefer her website because it just, like I said, that toggle button on each recipe to skew it into cups, done instantly. So I find when I need something like one of the side dishes we really like around here is cauliflower cheese. That's a very kind of a comfort food vegetable. They're big into vegetables, more so than Americans, I think. I always look up her red Leicester. Red Leicester is a type of really good cheese, cauliflower cheese. And so, yes, I tend to gravitate to her.
And we had another comment. Karen says that Iron Mountain, Michigan, in the UP also has some good pasty shops.
Okay, well, too bad about celiac disease, man, because prior to that, we would have gone on the pasty tour. I'm sure that would not have been a hard sell for Ben. So,
And then Kathy says the double cream they show on the GBBO looks way thicker than our heavy cream.
I would agree, but we can get what we can get. Maybe they're using, farm double cream, something that's it's quite, they're very into shop local. So perhaps on the show, they might have gone to a farm even and gotten something super excellent. But yeah, I think you're probably right, but you can get the same results if you use ours, as long as you're not doing trying to do clotted cream and it's been heat treated. They do a lot less treating, I got to tell you. I mean, remembering I would buy a loaf of bread there. Their granary bread is delicious. It's whole wheat with cracked grains in it, just excellent. And it's only good for 3 days. But that's because there's not one speck of preservative in it. And here, you might have a loaf of commercial bread for a week sometimes if it's not bakery bread. So you take the good with the bad, I think.
And somebody wants to know, can you put up the slide with the link for your book again?
Well, by all means, I would be happy to do that. I think I didn't go far from it in the slideshow. So there it is. So that the debate was, I am an old publishing person, an old editor, and I wanted to do, if I did it as a independently published, it should rise to the standard of being on a bookshelf at Barnes and Noble. And here in my town, it is. Wahoo! So I hired my cover artist is from York, actually, and the little cathedral in the lower right is Peterborough Cathedral. That's the city where I lived, and she specializes in illustrations, and that for travel book, that's kind of ideal. So she works a lot for the major publishing houses as a freelancer, and I thought, oh, I love her work. And so I was going to call it Stuck in the Toffee Pudding, actually. That was my name for this book for years until she quite rightly pointed out, I don't know if I can sell that on a cover. People will think it's a food book. I thought, oh. So yeah, you're kind of right. I love that title. So I had to break up with it. And I for like an entire week racked my brain and gotta thank Ben. He came up with this one. So I thank him in acknowledgments to Ben. That's it.
Well, Danielle echoes my thoughts of that she also loves the cover, and I have to say, it sounds like you did your cover right. She also wants to know if there is a target date for the audiobook to come out.
Well, funny you should ask. That is going to be sometime likely in the next 2 weeks. So I'm about 2/3 way through. And I have thankfully not turned into Peter Brady on you this evening, but I've had the worst head cold I'd have in a year. And my voice was cracking this morning. So I can only do dribs and drabs at a time at the studio. So, but I have my engineer is Jimmy. He's great. So we're going to get through it. And as soon as he can edit it for me, we'll be off. I suspect it'll be a couple weeks.
Okay, great. I just wanted to let everybody know that Claire was nice enough to let us record this program tonight. So in case you wanted to watch it again or share it with your friends, it'll be available starting probably sometime tomorrow. We will go ahead and send out emails with the link to that, as well as the link to get the recipes that she had talked about and the link to her website.
That'd be great. And I always tell people too, if you go to my website, if you get in the weeds, we'll put it that way, in the recipes, by all means write me, because likely I have screwed this up. And I'm happy to tell you what I know about how to put it right. But I tried to pick things that are a little bit more straightforward, things that you can just dump and mix and it's good. End of story.